A very special greeting to all participants. I want to especially thank the organizing committee and Professor Raphael Chesler from the Department of Forensic Sciences for extending the invitation to participate. I will initially attempt to delimit the topic. This time slot will be used to discuss the impact of using the ACEP methodology: analysis, comparison, evaluation, and verification in the forensic analysis of signatures and manuscripts. The topic delimitation is because it will exclusively focus on forensic signature analysis for expert identification purposes, exclusively in relation to this activity. In this brief time, I will try to at least sow a concern regarding the urgent need, in my opinion, for the expert community to establish true standards in the preparation of expert opinions. And this is important because we must ask ourselves the following question. If it is truly a standardized discipline, why are there contradictory conclusions in the same case? Of course, assuming that we are dealing with two specialists who are academically moderately trained, let's consider how signature comparison activity is a discipline that is generally relied upon by the judicial operator. Victims also rely on it, meaning that expert intervention is something common, something routine anywhere in the world, where it is taken as a valuable material evidence in different civil, criminal, or labor cases, and in some way, this expert evidence, the signature comparison, has granted or rather been given an excessive confidence to this means of evidence, because often the conclusions reached by the expert are considered absolute truths. So, if they are absolute truths, why are there two contradictory answers? Why are there two conclusions that are diametrically opposed? And if this happens, it is necessarily because we are facing an error of perception, an error in methodology, or some error that is not necessarily due to lack of intelligence, or lack of knowledge, or lack of competence. It is not even the lack of truth, but in some way it is because we conform to that thought in the obvious, or we do not question or consider any difficulty in our discipline, and we accept all the principles that have been adopted over time without questioning them, somehow obeying them blindly, and paying homage to the cliché and dogma that paralyzes our way of thinking. And if we do not assume that critical position regarding the work we carry out, then surely that indifferent act towards expert work can cause us to become numb in expert work, and we can make mistakes because we do not carry out any type of empirical validation. So, what is happening now is that there are more than 25 methods that have been detected, at least at the Latin American level, where different ways of approaching a signature comparison case are indicated, from the graphokinetic, deductive, holistic, signal methods, and all the methods have something in common, and it is that they are based on pattern evidence, where from a known element, which are the samples, it is compared to an unknown element, and from there, they point out a series of convergences and divergences, and we reach a conclusion of identity or non-identity. Some laboratories can also reach probabilistic conclusions. According to the precisely probabilistic nature of forensic sciences, most of the time, the forensic expert supports his conclusions based on different bibliography, often old bibliography related to works by different authors and from different latitudes, and not by adhering to true standards that have been adopted by expert communities or groups of experts. The expert tries to defend his position, and when there is contradiction because the result is not agreed upon, then there may be a disagreement between experts that leads to the participation of another expert who reaches a completely opposite conclusion. This, of course, affects the level of reliability and undermines the credibility that a forensic report may have in front of the judicial operator. Faced with this problematic situation, some, let's say, points have been identified that can work against greater confidence in the work carried out by the expert. First, there is no use of a uniform language, not even for the same region or country. There is no decision-making model in those proposed methods, which prevents knowing the degree of reliability or the margin of error or validity. There is also no development based on empirical validation through experimental studies. as occurs in some other latitudes. There is no sustained criterion about why the minimum sample should be 5 or 10 or 15 signatures, or why contemporaneity should be 3 or 5 years forward or backward. This has simply been imposed through different bibliographies without us really knowing a serious study that allows us to establish clearly why that imposed criterion should be accepted. Similarly, another interesting aspect is how the forensic analyst often, when not trained or not sufficiently trained or their training is deficient, issues value judgments in their expertise, indicating as authentic or false a signature when their job is to solve an identity problem. That is, the lack of training in epistemic matters is somehow a real problem when understanding the role we play as forensic analysts. Forensic experts are here to solve identity problems, not legal judgments or values, or authenticity or falsity issues. So, in this regard, it is important to point out that the true duty of robust science cannot be other than to support the justice system and to mitigate the possibilities of error based on what has been called unreliable evidence, using a methodology and the impact that a methodology like the ACEP method, analyzing, comparing, evaluating, and verifying by a blind pair, would somehow allow us to have a uniform language, distribute the phases of analysis, comparison, and evaluation, unify the criteria in signature identification from preliminary analysis to conclusions, so that a greater level of confidence is granted that guarantees the reliability of the result. In that sense, when we apply a standardized methodology, we see how the line we are following in the world, since the declaration made by the Australian Society of Document Examiners only in May 2023, where it points out the need to know the error rates. The same was said by the PCAST in 2016, which is the report of the Presidential Council of Science and Technology Censors, and the NIST in 2021, which recommends the inclusion of those relevant error rates in written reports. The Sydney Declaration of 2022 did the same, recognizing that forensic science deals with a continuum of uncertainties, and that uncertainties can be identified and quantified through research. Implementing these measures to further reduce the potential for error would somehow recognize what are the most common errors that can occur and why. There could be two contradictory conclusions. One is human error, where due to lack of training or lack of information updating, where the forensic expert, does not worry about training academically. These are hardly remediable. That is, it is very difficult for an expert who considers that his opinion has an absolute truth, as this can affect competence, because we could be facing an incompetent expert who would have fewer skills to know what role he should play. Errors in the procedure due to non-compliance with standards or requirements, such as originality, contemporaneity, and clarity of those concepts, not using a common language, or not knowing, for example, the probabilistic nature of forensic sciences by not knowing the possible opinion scales that have been, let's say, used by different forensic laboratories, are errors that somehow can ruin a very good expert opinion, added to observation errors either by some unjustified omission, by some false judgment of identity, or errors that exceed the limitations in practice or in discipline when issuing value judgments. This series of errors could somehow be diminished or controlled through the SCP methodology that has a scientific approach, and that somehow would positively impact and be applied to forensic discipline to develop a specific standard where there is really a homogenization of expert work, and where we could even lead to the affirmation of an interdisciplinary methodology that can then be validated through different laboratories or empirical studies to offer a much more reliable result, as has happened in different countries like Egypt, South Africa, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Philippines, Israel, etc. So the SCP methodology increases reliability, manages a uniform language, promotes scientific education in epistemological issues, Bayesian approaches, likelihood ratios, and urges judges and courts to scrutinize experts in a responsible manner to mitigate the possibility of error. That is, the ACEP methodology is the result of the study by expert communities and scientific working groups, which raises the quality of findings and enhances the quality of results through a blind verifier, to have a much more uniform criterion, and to have better assurance in the provision of the service, and to reduce the imposition of personal criteria in the preparation of forensic reports. So, in that sense, that was my contribution today, to propose the standardization of the SCP methodology for different laboratories, and to show its advantages over the fact that they do not exist, so that experts do not go around freely in hearings, exposing ourselves to very skilled lawyers in cross-examination, who can put us in a difficult situation by not having a standardization in the methodology used. Along with the presentation are some documents from PCAST, NIST, and the Scientific Working Group for Document Examiners that I will gladly share with you in the links provided on the page. Have a happy evening. And that was my intervention. A very special and affectionate greeting to all colleagues, comrades, and friends. Good evening.